Again, thank you all for coming. My name is Ali. Sorry. Our first question, actually, for the moderators, we'd like everyone to introduce themselves. If we could just start from Chef Sam and go down the line, that would be great. Introduce and tell us a little about yourselves.
My name is Sameh. I am the Imam of the Birmingham Islamic Society. I also teach Arabic at UAB as a adjunct professor. Came from Egypt. Graduated from Asal University in Egypt with BA, MA, and PhD in Islamic Studies. I'm actually also a professor there, but I'm authorized leave for a few years. I've been here in the United States for 10 years and married, and I have kids. I worked before in Raleigh, North Carolina and West Virginia before coming to Alabama.
My name is Lucas Gambino. I grew up in South Alabama, Fairhope, if anybody knows where that is. And in high school, in the early 90s, I started learning about Islam, probably senior year of high school. And for the course of 7 or 8 or so years, studied more and more and more, and was more inquisitive until 97-ish or so range, converted to Islam, and have been a member of the Muslim community in Birmingham largely since that time. Have 3 wife and 3 children, 15, 12, and 10. I graduated from UAB, proud blazer, 1995, I guess that was. And went to law school at Alabama, and my law practice really is transactional in nature. For those of you that aren't familiar with the way the law is typically bifurcated, you generally have litigators and then everybody else, the non-litigators. I'm kind of the everybody else, the corporate business law type, and so yeah, that's my background.
Good evening. My name is David Hodges. I grew up in a small town called Chickasaw, Alabama. Went to the University of Alabama. Went to Duke University for graduate school, and I'm blessed to have both a JD, a law degree, and a master's in history. My first year law school writing assignment was on the separation of church and state and those issues. So it's something I have a long time interest in. My law practice, however, is kind of the very basic bankruptcy, divorce, criminal law, small businesses, what we sometimes refer to as street law. I was not really raised in a church, but I was baptized in the Methodist Church in 1999, so I'm kind of a late comer to Christianity and to faith impacting my practice.
My name is Kip McClurg. I am one of the pastors at the Steady Hills United Methodist Church. I grew up in Pinson, outside Birmingham, and went to college at Tribeca Nazarene University in Nashville. And then my doctorate of ministry is from School of Theology at the University of South Swanee. And so I am a pastor, but I have a great love of church history, and much of course, American church history has to do with trying to figure out those freedoms, and so this is a joy for me to be here today. Thank you.
Hi, my name is David Schnier. I'm a rabbi here in Birmingham, and I often say it's dangerous to give a rabbi and a lawyer a microphone. So I'll just say a little bit about who I am, because for some of you, you have no basis of understanding what a Messianic Jewish congregation is, so I'm just going to briefly mention that. But I grew up in New York City. I was part of all 3 branches of Judaism. I've been rabbi here at Beth Hillel since 2013. And Beth Hillel is a congregation of Jews and Gentiles who are one in the Messiah, Yeshua, that's the Hebrew name for Jesus. And as a lawyer, I went to New York University and then the National Law Center in Washington, D.C. as part of George Washington University, as did my wife, Leslie, who's right here in the front row. She's also an attorney. I've been an attorney for 43 years, taught in law school, I've taught at the university level, and And also we served really very poor people in Ukraine for 12 years, and Holocaust survivors and orphans and alcohol and drug addicted folks and refugees of the civil war in eastern Ukraine. And finally, just to round the picture out, I'm also a dual citizen of the United States and Israel, so I bring a lot of perspectives to what we're going to share tonight.
I'm David Gespass. I am a lawyer in Birmingham. My practice these days is mostly civil rights. I spend my time suing police and representing prisoners. I come from this in maybe a little bit different perspective than others. I think of myself as part of the Mel Brooks Jewish tradition. I grew up in Brooklyn, actually not far from where Woody Allen grew up, but we don't really consider him part of the tradition. I don't know that anymore. I did spend 5 years in Hebrew school, but my perspective is secular. It is not one in which, while I understand that ethical traditions can impact the way one approaches work and one approaches law. I think, I view things from the perspective of a legal tradition as opposed to a religious tradition, which in many ways is what the Constitution says, but is under attack these days. And I should mention, since David did, my wife has way more degrees than I do. She's also my law partner, and she's sitting right here.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you guys taking out the time out of your, well, I guess night, not day. So, anyways, our first question, we'll just jump right into it. Our first question is, what is the basis or source of law in your religion? And please feel free to share a few examples or books or texts or otherwise. Well, just whoever wants to go first.
Is that intended for the religious leaders only, I think?
Right.
So basically, the source of law in the Islamic perspective is the Quran, which is first source, and the Sunnah, which is the prophetic tradition, the sayings, actions, and tacit approval of Prophet Muhammad reported to us through authentic means or authentic chains of transmission.
In the Christian tradition, the source of law would start with the Old Testament, and then as it is understood through the lens of the New Testament and the teachings of Jesus. Jesus had a unique perspective in that when asked if he should pay taxes, which is a secular issue, he said, show me a coin, and said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to the state what is the state, give to God what is God's. So that is somewhat of a dividing rod for how the Christian church approaches that. So our source is our faith that if we can live under the traditions or under the civil law, then we try to do that.
Okay, for my journey, the source of my faith are the words of Adonai, the written words, the law, the prophets, and the writings, which is in the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, and the Brit Hadashah, the New Covenant, which many of you may not know, was promised to the Jewish people in the book of the prophet of Jeremiah. It actually uses the term New Covenant. And through the leading of what we call the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit of God, the still small voice who helps you understand what God is writing about, because it can be taken, as we easily see, a lot of different directions. And one last thing is, some folks say, well, the Old Testament is this, but the New Testament is that. But the New Testament actually says all Scripture is inspired by God, and the only Scripture that existed at that time was the Old Testament. So it's giving value in the New Testament to the Old Testament. So we believe in one book, one story, and that's it.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is actually also for religious leaders this time. The question is, how strict are religious guidelines in your faith, and what do the guidelines encompass?
Basically, I mentioned Quran and Sunnah, and there are other sources like analogical deduction, being analogy between new cases and cases in the Quran. So there is sort of flexibility in providing solutions for no cases, and also the consensus of the Muslim scholars, custom of the people in a specific form. All these are things that enrich the Islamic law and provide flexibility to come up with laws that deal with everyday life in different walks.
In the Protestant tradition, we have an understanding of I'm sorry, I lost my track. What? Could you repeat that?
Right, so again, the question was, how strict are the religious guidelines in your faith, and what do the guidelines encompass?
Thank you. So if you look at the book of John in the Christian New Testament, it starts by saying, in the past, it puts a juxtaposition between the law and grace. And so in the New Testament, there is a move away from law and toward an understanding of grace such that it overrides ultimately the law. And so for Christians in my tradition, though law is very important, it is more important to ask what would a loving God do in this particular situation. And so it is not as clear or as codified as some other traditions are.
Okay. Well, I'm going to try to answer this both ways, as a lawyer and as a rabbi. So it's clear in the Old Testament there are very strict laws and there are clear consequences. So Book of Deuteronomy, God says, if you do this, and this really well, you're going to have blessing. And if you do this, and this really bad, you're going to have cursing. So it says, choose life and live. Choose the blessing. Why would you choose the curse? So Old Testament. Yeshua, Jesus said, if you love me, you will do what I tell you to do. So in some ways I can differ a little bit with the idea there. In fact, one pastor just said yesterday, there's law and grace in the Old Testament, and there's grace and law in the New Testament. There's both found in there, and I'll give you one example. Yeshua said that anger is the same as murder. And the consequences are for you, if you're angry with the guy at 4:59 during rush hour, you're walking in a murderous spirit. So I would not say that that's, it's strict as well, but like God made a way for Abraham and Isaac, the Lord makes a way through the death and resurrection of Yeshua to have us be able to walk in His commandments.
Okay. Our next question.
Excuse me. You have somebody else that you can never been able to talk.
The other David, you want to address that?
Actually, Mr. Smith, we were talking about the basis of religious law. So could you actually tell us what is the basis of, for example, the American Constitution or other laws? So if they not come from religion.
Sure. 30 seconds. I would argue, I actually just finished this book not long ago called Law and the Rise of Capitalism. And I would argue that the basis of European law and then American constitutional law is in fact derives from the replacement of feudalism in Europe with mercantilism and then capitalism, at which time things like property rights became much more important, much more essential. And so the Constitution says, people keep saying life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Constitution actually says life, liberty, and property. And the balance that the Constitution seeks to strike is between individual liberty and the right to acquire property. And so I would say that constitutional law obviously comes from British tradition, but it embodied the attempt to create a republic that in fact was an enormous compromise among really people who disagree very virulently, as much as today they did back then, between Federalists and non-Federalists. And the Constitution itself is a compromise that tried to unite all of the former British colonies, despite the very stark differences among them.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so our next question is, what are some common examples in which you implement the rules of religious law in your everyday lives? And this question is for everyone.
As I say, I do not directly, but at the same time, I'm quite proud of my heritage, more so the heritage of Einstein than the religious heritage. But there is a really deep Jewish ethical tradition that is important to me. Now, I'll say really quickly that, as in every other broad religion writ broad, there are any number of different denominations and different traditions. The one that I honor is the tradition of fighting for the dispossessed, the people who are poor, the people who are needy.
This question for the lawyers.
Yes, sir.
This is for you.
Basically, when we speak of Sharia law, it is everything that relates to our life. Islam is a revealed way of life, so there's a personal part of it, a social part, relation to the country we're living in and state, and international relations is also part of the things that are covered under Islamic law. So when it comes to my personal law, prayers, acts of worship, marriage and divorce, inheritance laws, Muslims are practicing them very well. There's no contradiction with any laws. When it comes to the penal law, basically it is the right of the government. It's not an individual thing. So I would find myself freely practicing Islam, beliefs, code of conduct, and acts of worship and laws as well.
I think it's helpful to think about, when we talk about law, what type of law we're talking about. Whether it is private moral, our families, our relationships, our how we want to worship. Whether it's public moral, what we think of as crimes, things that if you don't prohibit them, affect your society, the health of your society and the quality of your society. I would argue that there's private commercial law, property rights, business transactions, and then I would argue there's public civil law, where we put our roads, how we conduct our elections. And so I think the answer to how much religion should be brought into our laws. It depends a great deal on what area you're talking about. And the problem we have, of course, is there are the hot button issues. When something that is maybe a private moral consequence, who we marry, for instance, is brought into the public realm, and you have competing ideas. And you know, I personally think the idea of the separation of church and state and the First Amendment gives us a framework to kind of work through those. It may be messy and it may be loud, but I think the First Amendment gives us some clear guidelines, and I think it's helpful if you focus on what type of issue it is.
Are we looking at question 7?
Questions?
Is it one?
Yes, that is question.
Okay, I would just like to answer this a little bit.
Actually, before we continue, I'd just like to say a comment. So I believe the microphones are detachable if you guys want to. We have a comment from the audience. If everyone can move the microphone a bit closer so the voice sounds a little clearer. Thank you.
Okay, can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
All right, so this question just got answered a lot of different ways, so I want to speak to that. I have found countless times evidence of due process, equal protection, witnesses to establish facts, witnesses who lie, all those kinds of rules are in the Old Testament. So there's a lot already that came from the Old Testament that's in our law. And as far as separation of church and state, I'm sure it's going to have a big difference for most. But if I look at the framers of the Constitution, my understanding is they meant that they wanted the state out of the church's business. And that's a lot different to say there can be no religion in public life. So that's a huge debate now, more and more so. But for specific examples for number 7, I can think of a few that what we believe in affects the life around us. One main one is someone offends you, go to them alone. That's a way of people ordering their methods of resolving difficulties. The other option is gossip and slander, which usually produces a bigger fire. So that's a big one for me. Don't repay evil with evil. Our natural inclination is, especially when you're driving on 65 or 459, you wouldn't want to take of that, what's going on in your mind. So, and one that was mentioned over here, and we had great experience in Ukraine, there's the poor, and then there's the mafia. So, and most of the people are the poor. So you can't avoid serving the poor there, and we work with Holocaust survivors and widows and the poor generally, and refugees from the war in the eastern part of Ukraine. So those are kinds of things, those moral issues come to bear in my life. That's the way I want to live life.
Yeah, I'll say, again, the question was what common examples do we have of sort of effectuating religious laws in our daily lives? I understand the question. You know, for me, to sort of piggyback some of what Sheikh said is that, you know, prayer is an integral part, bedrock component of the Islamic faith. And so when I think of some of the things that I do on a daily basis that are sort of driven by my faith, prayer is certainly one of them. As Muslims, as many people probably know, we pray 5 times a day. Working in an office environment, that's not always easy to do. You're either in a meeting, on a phone call. There's not always a place to pray in private. And so it's difficult. But you sort of make it your priority to do the best you can to do so. The same thing with, being charitable to need. As the rabbi said, not gossiping. That's very common in all 3 faiths. I know to not engage in that kind of thing. Lowering, another thing, I'm just thinking of my daily struggles in terms of being in an office environment. Lower your gaze when there are people of the opposite gender that maybe are revealing too much, wearing clothes that are a little revealing. These are sort of struggles that you have every day. One thing that I can speak to that just happened to me earlier this week was talking to a client on the phone about a contract, and this individual happened to be Muslim, but he sent me this contract. I'm looking over the contract. I get to the point of it where it's sort of the primary provision of this agreement is where we were, and I noticed that half the sentence was gone, just a fragment. clearly, the other party intended for it to say A and B. It only said A. And because it only said A, it benefited my client. Well, he wasn't paying him, his client, but he was the guy I was talking to. And I had posed to him, and what should we do about this? Thankfully, he was of like mind and recognized that, we really ought to tell the other side, even though it benefited him to say nothing, we should tell the other side what's missing and bring that to their attention and not try to sneak anything by anybody. So those are the sort of types of business ethics that are mandated by our faith. It's difficult sometimes in practice to do those things, and thankfully I knew this guy was going to respond the way he did because I know him, but I may have other clients that have a different way of things and might not want to reveal that to the other side, and that's their prerogative. I'm just a representative, they make that choice. But, I risk being viewed as sort of a weak advocate if I'm trying to help the other side. So these are just examples of things where your priorities have to be kept intact, and there's going to be so many times throughout the day where a challenge or a test is in front of you, and I'd like to think that I pass the test most of the time. I probably don't, but I try.
I think for me that the practices of prayer and worship are a vital part of what happens on a very regular basis, not every day.
First of all, I don't know if David meant this, but I really have to point out that there are many, many people who did not come here to escape oppression, but came here because of oppression. I also say that in my view, at least, the Constitution is a living document. What it said 250 years ago is not what it stands for today. I know there's a lot of debate about that, but the truth is that the founders wrote a pretty vague document that was subject to interpretation precisely because I said before, they really didn't agree on a lot. Now, in terms of how the Constitution, as I view it, allows full exercise of religion or non-religion. Right? The Constitution also says for any federal office, no religious test needs to be applied, can be applied. And so the only time, in my view, in which religion can impact upon, or the Constitution can impact upon religion, is when something is so regarded as so unacceptable that it will not be allowed. Human sacrifice, for instance, was a religious practice for lots of different people at one time. That is something that will not be allowed. I think, Rabbi Hillel famously said when he was asked to explain the Torah while standing on one leg, that do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. And that, I think, he said that's the entire Torah, the rest is commentary. And I think that if the Constitution is applied in that way, now there are people that won't apply it, but if it's applied in that way, then we have a structure that enables the full and exercise of any religious principle without impacting the legal structure of the United States and the Constitution.
Music is interesting. All right. So I have a kind of wide-ranging ideas on this, but I'd start with the principle that freedom of religion or faith are protected by the Constitution, but not all of our actions or speech based on faith are protected, and that seems difficult. At the same time, I I was a young man during the free speech times at Berkeley, and everybody wanted to have free speech. And today, not many people want free speech anymore. They can't tolerate ideas that they don't believe in, they don't like, you know. And I just tell people, get tough. This is a real world where there are going to be ideas you don't like. Your ideas, your good ideas is what you have to deal with those. But shutting people up is something that I find intolerable. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. We have laws about libel and slander, and even fighting words. But lo and behold, I found a Supreme Court decision just today, Rob versus City of St. Paul, that talked about restricting the government's ability to people speak about things that we don't like, and they said it was not tolerable. It was something that we just had to deal with. So we're in a time where the crush is on faith and speech as to what we can say or not say in public. And I have to tell you, it's not unusual for a university's laws restricting speech and a comfort zone where no one will feel bad about themselves or what they believe. And the courts constantly toss those out. Because the university is where you're supposed to be able to speak, I think. And so I understand that some things that can be said about your individual faith that can be horrible to you, but that's a price we pay here so that we can speak whatever we need to say, although some words you can't. And today, this whole idea of faith and action, there are huge issues that we're facing. Polygamy is one, or animal sacrifice I haven't heard about too much, but the whole relationship between a husband and a wife and what your religion is, and how your faith clashes with the laws of the land. These are big issues that are coming up, and we're going to have to work hard to resolve them.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I'm glad this question, I saw it on the list because I had heard, and I'm sure many of you have probably heard, a notion that's usually put forth in the media, which, it's probably worth saying that many, probably everyone in this room has some knowledge about Christianity. Most of us have knowledge of Judaism to some degree. Most of what many Westerners know about Islam is their only access to Islam, and that's through media outlets. And I understand that. I don't condemn them for that, but that's just the reality. And I've heard oftentimes it said in different settings that a Muslim that is abiding by his or her faith cannot abide by the U.S. Constitution. Those two things are just naturally mutually exclusive. And I would argue that it's absolutely not the case. And maybe that's because I have studied the faith and have given more thought to it than the sort of headline. But and Sheikh, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the Islamic principle is basically that a Muslim that is in a local community, not should or might consider must, is required to follow the laws of that local community, unless those laws prohibit the Muslim from doing something that they're required to do in their faith, or conversely, if they're being required to do something that's prohibited in their faith, then they should not do those things. But as you think about those things, you mentioned David Gespass, the human sacrifice. I mean, I'm not aware. I was racking my brain trying to think of examples where there might be a law that gets passed that would prevent me from doing something that my faith requires me to do. If there would be a law passed that says we can't pray, then I guess I'd have that problem. It seems awfully unlikely. Or is there a law that says you have to drink alcohol, for example? These are the kind of laws that seem so silly, yet there was a huge crusade, as everybody probably remembers, to ban Sharia law, and that it was soon to take over and all of this. And so the only real life example I can think of where there may be a disconnect, perhaps, between U.S. law and lawyers. Yeah, well, that's true. That's a good point. But you brought up the point about interest-bearing contracts. The one I was going to mention is, as many of us know, in France, there is a law currently, I think still, that prohibits Muslim women from wearing the hijab, the headscarf covering some of the ladies here are wearing, in public. And, you know, not being a female, it's hard for me to really speak on that issue. I'd love to hear the Sheikh's thoughts, and I don't know if any of the sisters in the crowd that wear hijab might speak to that. It'd be nice to hear from somebody who wears and somebody who does not, to see if the opinion is different. But that's one example of something where I could see someone who's required to do something. But should that person not go in public? That seems awfully unreasonable to ask. Should they leave the country? Should they take their hijab off? I mean, these are the kinds of dilemma that you might have in the interest in mortgages, I guess, could possibly be one too. But does anybody in the audience want to speak to that at all? I don't mean to look at anybody, but and if not, we'll have a shake if you want to speak to it. Just the issue of what is the proper course of conduct for a Muslim woman in France, where it's prohibited to wear hijab in public. What should they do?
Basically, we should do what Mr. Gespass is doing, is to fight for their freedoms. It's a requirement in Islamic perspective. From Islamic perspective, it's an obligation, and if someone is unable to practice an Islamic obligation, he should seek a solution for this, or try to take another road, which is not it's not the right course of action. Just leaving. So basically, fight for your rights. And we have a state of necessity. If someone feels like their life is in danger, necessity allows permissibility or dictates permissibility. So one has to take an alternative solution in order not to harm their life, or if this is the situation.
I'd like to add, in France, we lived in France for 6 years, and France is an equal opportunity discriminator. So you can't wear a cross or Star of David to public school, or if you work for the government, you just can't wear it. We haven't done that bad here, but you know, if you bring a Bible and put it on your desk at work, you know, you get in trouble with your employer or stuff like that. So these are interesting issues. And for me, if something's really worth it to you, then just like in the civil rights era, peacefully people demonstrate. They went to jail, they filled the jails, and something changed. I'm not saying that well, you don't have that issue here though about this. So in a sense, the United States is not limiting, but in France it's very unlimited, and probably the country is 99% Catholic. That's number one. And there were religious wars in France where the Catholics slaughtered the Protestants. So they have a very sordid past in a way. Also, they kicked the Jews out of France, so that's another story.
As we said, the state of necessity, if someone is in that situation, they probably think of taking off the cover to save their life, if that reaches this case.
Okay. Okay, so thank you all. It's fine, a little loud so we can drown out some of the music.
That's what we're trying to do, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're fine, thank you. So actually, we have a lot more questions. However, due to the time, we're going to start taking questions from the audience. So any of the audience, please raise your hand, and you're free to ask any of our members any questions. Any question, as long as it's reasonable.
Okay. Can I make one suggestion about this too? I have always resented this idea that the people up on the podium are the givers of all knowledge, and that all you people out there are supposed to do is absorb stuff. So I would encourage people not just to ask questions, but if they have opinions about stuff, if they disagree with anything that was said, I would like to hear that as well.
So if anyone has a question.
Well, I think it's very clear that all these issues of wearing a hijab or a cross or having a Bible would be against the Constitution if it was permitted. It would be against the First Amendment. And I don't see that happening in our country.
Well, let me just say, in private companies, definitely does happen. So the idea, do you have free speech? And if you're working for Google well, maybe yes, maybe no. So it's all, there's no state action in a private company. And I've had too many people tell me they've gotten in trouble for having a little plaque that has something religious in it as opposed to a neutral thing. Have a good day, for instance.
Yeah, I just don't see our government imposing any of these laws and rules.
There's a
This is a question from the Schneer's answer.
I can say it loud.
Sure.
I don't know if I can say it just right. David knows me well enough to maybe help me out, but it sounds like to me that some of the rules matter much more than others between the religions. So like prayer and worship, some of those are much more important than some of the lesser. I think they're lesser as a Christian. We have some that don't matter quite as much, that are not as hot. So how do you distinguish between, when it comes to laws, the ones that are deal breakers? And I think it seems like the ones like worship and prayer, most of us can understand that those are really some of the more important ones amongst all of the religions. But then it seems like lately it's gotten down into some that every hot topic, every little difference matters the most. Like I think of the one with the baker that doesn't want to bake a cake for somebody that's going to get married, that's homosexual, or doesn't want to, if you own Hobby Lobby and you don't want to offer insurance for someone that could use birth control. That seems like at some point you have to be able to differentiate between all of the rules that you have with your religion. How do you, I think about you, David, how would you do that? At some point, every rule that you have for each religion can't be on an equal footing.
Let me say this. I taught, a couple of years ago, I taught a class on human rights here at UAB. And one of the things I emphasized is that these are very easy questions when rights don't come into conflict. But that doesn't always happen. The hard questions are when rights do come into conflict. And there's no simple answer to that. And it's obvious from how divided people are over questions like that. My view is very different from the Supreme Court's on a lot of that stuff. But that is, part of the process, I think, of living in a society. When you have to interact with other people, you have to struggle over those issues. And I'm not going to, I've been wrong often enough in my life, and I'm not going to say I know all the answers. I think the main thing is that people have to go into this willing to listen and to recognize other points of view without abandoning their own principles.
So basically, from the Islamic perspective, there are 5 rulings. Something could be obligatory, versus on the other side, the other end, it's prohibited. In between, there is something that's recommendable to do, versus something that's detested, which is discouraged to do, but it's not prohibited. You're not incurring sins if you're doing that. In between the 2 and 2, you have the permissible, just like habitual things that you do. In Islam also we have rulings which are constant, unchangeable, all through history, geography, but there is a verdict. A verdict is where the scholar builds the bridge between the ruling that's in the sources and the reality. So sometimes it differs from one person to another. For example, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was asked if a guy came to him and he said, do I have repentance, committed sins, is repentance possible? He said yes. And another person, he said no. And when asked about that, it's actually one of the followers of Prophet Muhammad, he said that the other guy to him, I said, repentance is not possible. I saw in his eyes that he was planning to commit a crime and then come back to repent. So there are a lot of these examples that someone might be like having to deal with interest. And basically, he has a big family, he's unable to move to a small house, and it is like a necessity for him and puts him in a difficulty, or his family in a difficulty. So he's allowed in that case, in that strict case, to take a loan with interest if there's no other available sources. So this is what personal reasoning in Islamic Sharia law is about. It's not just the laws that everyone applies them strictly, but that's why the religious scholars are needed to make this verdict, to build the bridge between the ruling and the actual things.
Lawyers, pastors, and imams trying to pass the mic. That's interesting. So I want to respond to your question. The first is, there was this Jewish guy, Apostle Peter, and this is from a Jewish Christian viewpoint, and he said, if you've broken the least of the laws, it's as if you've broken them all. So there is stuff in the New Testament that says, you're in for a little or a lot. This is all important. But having said that, just to use the Supreme Court bakery case, the owner of the place had a lot of clients who were homosexuals. He served them all the time. When it got to marriage, that was the too much. He couldn't do it at that point. And the Supreme Court, in the argument, said, the commission in Colorado, I think, who came up with this decision and fined the guy over $100,000 for a cake, did not take into account the rights and beliefs of the baker enough. They just ran over it like it meant nothing. So one reason I'm not practicing law right now is because I founded a system that doesn't resolve difficulties well. And a lot of it is a function of money. So you have a lot of money, you're going to skate, and if you don't, you're going to slammer. Or you lose your case, you go up against a big company. We've lost the ability. That case should have been resolved at the lowest level. For it to have gone all the way to the Supreme Court proves to me our system is broken. That's just my opinion. How did we get there? Which is kind of what you're saying. Why can't these things get resolved with all of the effort? And maybe it speaks to the polarization of our society, but I think we need to do a better job. That's my opinion. I'm sticking to it.
Actually, if we can move on to the next question, please. Unless, Pastor, would you like to?
So, my question is building up on your question. And I heard something, maybe it's a nuance in what you said, which is the separation between church and state is more for protection of the religion from the encroachment of the state. So, does that mean that the church can encroach on the state, but the state cannot encroach on the religion? Did I hear that? Or what, am I reading too much in between the lines? Because we're living in a place where I'm feeling a certain group of people are imposing their religious strength and power and muscle on minorities that are religious or not religious.
For my tradition, the previous bishop for the United Methodist Church in North Alabama wrote an article about, I guess it's been 10 years ago, when the question of the Ten Commandments statue was very at the forefront. And his argument was that the concern that we had was that to allow that to be a part of interpreting law specifically is to give the state the ownership or the stewardship of a religious document that we can consider ours, and certainly other religions too, but it's not the state's document. It's not the state's to interpret. And so, from our perspective, it was very necessary to have a separation between the two to preserve our capacity to interpret our own documents and to remove that from the state. Now, there are other Protestant religious groups that differ with that, but from ours, that wall of separation is very important.
Actually, before anyone continues, just for the sake of time, we're going to start minimizing the talk time to 45 seconds, sorry. So just so we can try to maximize any more questions in the crowd. So.
Basically, I relate to this case that mentioned by Dr. Hussein because I had a personal case where my son came to me one day and he said,